Welcome to the ANEW Insight podcast, empowering and inspiring your journey to optimal health. Hosted by Dr. Supatra Tovar, clinical psychologist, registered dietitian, fitness expert, and author of Deprogram Diet Culture. Rethink your relationship with food, heal your mind, and live a diet-free life. I follow my guests' journey to optimal health, providing you with the keys to unlock your own wellness path. Tune in and evolve with us. Hello and welcome to the ANEW Insight podcast. I am very excited to have award-winning dietitian, root cause nutritionist, and host of the very popular Less Stressed Life podcast, Christa Biegler, with us today. Christa, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Supatra.
Yay, I'm so excited to have you. I was honored to be on her podcast, and I am doubly honored to have her on mine. And I am going to pick her brain on everything root cause nutrition today. Before we do that, I'm going to read a little bit about Christa, and then we'll get into our questions. Christa Biegler is an award-winning dietitian, root cause nutritionist, and, as I said, host of the very popular Less Stressed Life podcast, where she breaks down complex health issues into simple, actionable steps. As the founder of Less Stressed Life Nutrition, she specializes in helping people overcome food sensitivities, endless supplementation, or costly testing that often leaves people more confused than supported. Christa is known for her generous teaching style, her ability to translate science into practical tools, and her belief that symptoms are the body's early love notes, guiding people back toward balance. Her work focuses on rebuilding resilience through stress repair, calming the immune system, and restoring gut integrity so people can return to eating a wide variety of foods. She also brings a grounded, evidence-based lens to conversations around weight loss medications, highlighting the often ignored risks of malnutrition, muscle loss, and nutrient depletion for individuals using these drugs. We're going to tap into that just briefly. It's not necessarily her area of expertise, but it's something I'm interested in. Christa's mission is to help people heal at the root, feel safe in their bodies again, and create lasting health without restriction or fear. Christa, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and quite an intro. So I'll do my best to live up to everything.
Yes, I really do love your mission, especially lasting health without restriction or fear, especially when it comes to creating safety within the body. This is something that is a huge focus of mine as well. I would love to hear your inspiration on what brought you to focus on root cause healing rather than, I think, a lot of nutritionists, restriction-based nutrition.
You know, I think you just, I'm a questioner by programming. And so for me, when you realize that something isn't as root cause as you thought, which people get pretty hot button around food. But if I go back, a little over a decade, I'm a dietitian. So I thought adjusting your diet is pretty cool. And there are some incredible benefits to doing intentional experiments around changing your diet, removing the unnecessary things like the ultra high processed stuff, the artificial colors and preservatives. That is all lovely and wonderful. But the result that I was seeing, and I have a lot of my own story as well, and I'll just tell a little snippet of it because I think it's important. I dealt with what I would call the first of a few health crises around 10 years ago. And there was a lot of stress going on at the same time. I had a couple of toddlers. I was navigating a career change, et cetera. So, all of the perfect storm of things. And I woke up one morning. I'm sure it wasn't really just waking up one morning. I'm sure there was many messages and whispers before that. But I woke up one morning with a rash all over my face and my neck. And it was painful. And it was different than anything I'd really experienced before. I'd had some dry skin that I thought was genetic in the winter. And my experience was I had trouble finding anyone to help me with it. I was getting pretty superficial information. I kind of cruised past dermatologists or doctors at that point, but I saw a lot of different integrative and alternative health practitioners. I saw a famous gut health practitioner online who told me I could do nothing after a couple of stool tests. which was interesting because we're just a product of our experiences. And so I kind of vowed to never do that to somebody. Right, to really invalidate their experience overall. But around
Right.
that same time, I had gotten some additional training. There's so much to say about food sensitivities, and I think breaking it open as best as possible and telling people maybe the right or wrong way to approach this entire concept and what's really going on under the hood, because food sensitivities are superficial. And so, you can adjust your diet and you can get great changes, you can get great results, but there's other pieces that need to be in place in order for that to be lasting or to change. So part of my story was I got the results, and much like an average human, I was a little disappointed that many of my favorite foods like basil and red peppers were on this food sensitivity report. And that can be pretty consistent with gut permeability because these foods are crossing the gut lining more often. And so they're essentially triggering an immune response more frequently. That's a pretty common thing. Food sensitivities in general are pretty malleable. So I did the wrong thing, which was to put that on the shelf and be like, I'll get back to that later. So we'll shift, every few days or a week or whatnot. So at some point I implemented that maybe a month or two after I got those results, not best practice, by the way. And when you don't have a plan around changing your diet or doing something ultra restrictive, it can go kinda badly. You can be
Mm.
hungry. And so I remember rummaging through the pantry like a raccoon one day because I didn't have enough food and I was like had not fed myself well enough. And I reached in and grabbed a handful of pecans and I put them in my mouth and like within moments my eye was swelling and I'd never had anything like it. And the reason that this story is
Wow.
important is because when you're dealing with an already compromised state, an already stressed state, an already malnourished state, which by the way, believe me, I thought I was the picture of health, right? I was a very health conscious person who taught health. I mean, I wasn't doing crazy unhealthy things. I was drinking kombucha like it was going out of style because I thought it was the healthiest thing I could do, right? Which is a little dicey of a conversation. But the
Mm.
point is that I had created a reaction from that restriction. It was actually an additional stressor on my body. Now, that didn't there's a lot more to the story. Essentially, I really struggled to find people to help me clear my own stuff. I had to dig into the research and kind of crawl out of a hole of food reactions. It was not fun, and like most humans, I just wanted to slam the door shut on that chapter, right? We want to get better and like not deal with it again, right? That's our
Mm.
normal experience. And I was presenting to a group of moms from a Facebook group about different types of food reactions because sensitivities are quite different than allergies, and generally people don't always know that. And so I was discussing that, and I had a couple moms approach me about skin stuff and blah blah blah. So it's all kind of like history from there. But what I was seeing later as a practitioner, even though my story had that little part too, was that maybe there's a large percentage of people that were feeling a lot better when they changed their diet. And there's many reasons that can be, right? Or were they actually just getting rid of the crap? I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of right and wrong way to adjust the diet. And so I'm happy to share that because unfortunately, what I see is people restrict and then they see a reduction of symptoms and we actually go into fear. And so in fear, we don't actually broaden or they try to bring things back and they're reacting. It's because it's masking the problem, right? If you restrict all your carbs and you're improving symptoms, but you add back carbs and you start having symptoms, it's not because you're just healing yourself from restricting carbs. I really don't align with that. It's because you've got something where you're not processing and digesting it. And there's many other categories of food, naturally occurring food chemicals that will cause similar types of reactions, different types of reactions. And it kind of drives people crazy, understandably, because they see a difference. They may or may not see a difference, but many see a difference when they change their diet. And so, what worried me or really concerned me is people started restricting their diets and they would become more and more restrictive. And they ended up in a place where I was at one point in my story, which was they were actually creating more reactions and more sensitivities. And so, when you realize what's under the hood of food sensitivities, you realize that food sensitivities are sort of the top level. It's sort of how it's manifesting in the body, but it's not how you correct restricting the food is not how you correct the food sensitivity. It's honestly as superficial as a steroid for a skin. It's really just taking the alarm out of the
Yes.
battery.
I wanna get into that more. So you're saying that food sensitivities are, the kind of the top layer of what's going on. Let's then go deeper. What are the main causes of food sensitivities? We have ultra processed foods, we have kind of, chemical laden environment, pesticides, but what's the deeper levels of food sensitivities? What causes
Yeah.
this?
Well, and I would put a couple more layers on the top as well. So different types of food sensitivities, people will find I think something that was really popular in the last decade was autoimmune paleo, and that was eliminating all carbs, dairy, top 8 allergens, but also nightshades. I would honestly argue how many of these people had mold exposure because all of those things are going to feed there was oxalates and histamines, et cetera. So underneath the hood of what's going on with food sensitivities is if we go back to understanding gut permeability. And so if you eat a healthy food like an apple, and you're not digesting it well, what's supposed to happen in the body is you're supposed to break that down super duper tiny, right? You're not supposed to have like particles of apple. You're supposed to have different nutrients that your body can actually do something with and send off to the factories of the body, right? The overall, the organ systems, the different processes. But when the apple is not being broken down fully and completely, and it's crossing the gut membrane or the gut lining prematurely, so the gut lining can be like semi-permeable like nylons, or it can have some bigger gaps like fishnet tights. And so when you have larger particles getting across that lining, and this is kind of like the 101 of food sensitivities in general of why it's a digestion issue and it's a gut issue in other ways. It's like leaky gut doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? So we'll talk
Mm,
about that too. But when that apple is crossing and these larger particles across the cell the across the intestinal lining prematurely, you have these large particles, and the immune system, which mostly resides in the gut, right, 70% of it, says, hey, this particle, like this looks like an invader. This doesn't belong here. I'm going to go ahead and shoot inflammatory mediators at this. Okay. So I use the analogy of a Nerf gun because there's actually multiple types of mediators or colors of Nerf gun bullets. And so there's
mm,
IgG, the green ones. The colors have nothing to do with anything. It's really just like the picture of it, right? So there's IgG as one kind of inflammatory mediator that's being fired. IgM is another, different types of T cells, etc. So there's many. And if we think about the difference, this is a great place to even insert what's the difference between allergies and sensitivities. So there is another immune mediator called IgE, E for elephant, right? And IgE reactions are allergies. Usually we consider these static, consistent, ongoing. Usually you go to the allergist and they do either a skin or a blood test to diagnose this, hopefully both. Depends. There's some nuance there, and that's their area, really. And that's meant to be reproducible, right? That's what we're looking for in medicine is a reproducible, standardized black and white test, right? No,
mm.
not something that's going to shift all the time necessarily, right? Um, and so that's IgE. It's a different type of Nerf bullet overall. And that's going to cause maybe some slightly different reactions and sensitivities. We do see a little overlap, to be perfectly honest. But usually with allergies, we think of those significant ones. That doesn't mean they're always like that. It can be rashes, but a lot of times we're thinking of anaphylaxis. And so what's happening was your question. What's happening under the hood of food sensitivities? So one, we are potentially not breaking something down. We're not digesting well. I always love to tell my clients, like, go ahead and write that on my tombstone. No one was digesting. And there's many reasons why we can talk about it. So no one was digesting. And then something was going on where there was kind of a immune system miscommunication at some point, right? So was it immune system mediators firing at that food? That's usually if it's a true sensitivity, that's typically what's happening. And so I use an apple, but I could have used broccoli. It could be literally anything you consume. So if you ever got a food sensitivity test and it was foods you ate all the time, that's classical, like what was crossing the membrane often is what the immune system is firing at. Sometimes it's obscure and it's a little different. There can be some variables there. So there's a digestion issue. And then there is what is the immune system doing with the information issue? And that
Right.
might be gut permeability or leaky gut, right? And we have thousands of research papers that say leaky gut is factual, it's a real thing. But I personally don't think leaky gut is quite root cause enough. I really
Mm,
don't. I think we have to go to what was causing the leaky gut. Now, the cool part is we're going to circle around the same topics. We're going to talk about stress a lot, suppressing digestion, and we're going to talk
yes.
about stress. Honestly, with the poor digestion, it sort of feeds the dysbiosis. And the dysbiosis, the analogy for that is sort of like we've all got this lawn, or we've all seen a lawn, and a perfect lawn is not actually realistic. Most lawns are going to have some weeds, and that's the case with our gut microbiome. It's going to have some weeds, And with those weeds, you know this from the lawn, they steal nutrients and they give off their own waste, right? And so they actually impair digestion further. So there's a chicken and an egg scenario happening. What was causing the digestion? You actually need to address both things overall, like what's going on with the weeds and the dysbiosis, as well as um, digestion from the top to the bottom, right? It's not just a why aren't we digesting? It's, well, there's reasons all the way from the top to the bottom we may not be digesting. And I think that's such an important thing. But my thing is like the food sensitivities are superficial to everything else going on. And
Yes.
there's more as well with the toxic burden. If your detoxification bucket is full and overflowing, you're going to consume foods that aren't necessarily toxic, but it's how your body is metabolizing them. Remember that the weeds give off waste. So when the bucket's already full and those weeds are giving off more waste, it's adding more stress to the trash can, right? It's adding more trash. And so it will overflow also as well, and you'll get more symptoms from there. So you're going to see issues from the top to the bottom, gut wise, digestion wise, what's going on in the immune system. That's all sort of gut bucket. And then you're going to have issues with the drainage and detoxification bucket if the toxic burden bucket is full. And this is hard to test. I think symptoms are more helpful to help us identify it personally as a starting point. There's lots of different types of tests, but it's a little all over the place. Unfortunately, it's not super succinct. And so, but having a high toxic burden load is going to make you wake up with things like joint pain
Oh,
or have
yes.
joint pain that kind of migrates or gets better as you get up or seems triggered by foods or things like that. It's going to look like potentially sensitive to smells. Overall, it might be brain fog. Brain fog can be multiple systems are involved, but things like that, right? It's like I have symptoms, and I think maybe sort of it's associated with food. It's like, okay, well, what's actually the food triggering in the body? And that's the other thing. A lot of foods, as we talked about before, have natural food chemicals, and so if you're consuming a lot of foods with histamines, it's not that the histamine's the enemy. It's also pretty superficial, but this is, I mean, people know this now. They're well aware from Google that they're like, I have histamine intolerance. I'm like, yeah, well, what's causing that, right? Here's the things that
Exactly.
increase the histamine, and then how is it metabolized through the body? It's the same stuff. It's what's going on with the overall digestion of that neurotransmitter or that natural food chemical, and how is it being cleared from the body overall?
Exactly. And I would say going even further into root cause, yes, we can talk about everything that we're ingesting and the different chemical makeup of what we're ingesting. But let's talk about the system itself and
Yes.
what does stress do to the system? This
Yes.
is my area because I combine psychology and
Mm,
nutrition. And we can see that when we're in a sympathetic nervous system state, which most people are most of the
yeah.
time in
Yeah.
this kind of toxic news cycle society we live in, we're constantly stressed. And I don't think people fully understand exactly what constant stress does to us
Mhm.
physiologically. If
Yeah.
you can explain how that affects our digestion and,
The other
creates the
systems.
leaky gut and
Mhm.
these nutrients getting through and being targeted by our immune system, that would help people a lot.
Yeah. And the goal, of course, is not no stress, but I to just speak to the front end of that for a moment, something I'm really passionate about that you I'm sure do a ton about is this unrealized stress. Is that a lot of times with high achievers, we don't necessarily even feel stressed because it's been our baseline for so long. It's been so normal. So sometimes we kind of need this little, maybe it needs to show up on a test result. Like maybe it's showing up in these physical manifestations. So, really briefly, there's a few core places that stress really challenges the body. It really adds tax. It taxes the body in different places. So, the first is digestion. When you are in a stress state, of course, we always use the example running from the tiger, your body could care less about digesting, right? And so when we are distracted, when we are not really doing the things to prime digestion, which would be literally enjoying what we're eating. That's as simple as it would be. It would be smelling it to actually stimulate the cephalic response and the digestion in the mouth, chewing it enough. I know that's really simple, but it's like actually the hard part, to be honest. And that's why we have recurrent things upstream and downstream very often, to be honest. Um, so with stress, our stomach acid gets suppressed first. Our stomach acid is essential for digesting proteins, assimilating certain nutrients, especially B12, which is huge for energy, And by the way, if you can go test that, but our reference ranges have gotten a lot lower. It's kind of pathetic, actually. So just so you know, it should be at least 500 or above. So that's actually one thing you can get checked if you ever needed to. It doesn't necessarily mean, that you don't. There's some simple basic things people can do to test stomach acid, and pretty much everyone fails. We can talk about that if you want. But stress suppresses stomach acid. It also suppresses all digestive function, pancreatic enzyme function, etc. So this is why I say no one was digesting from the perspective of I was eating quickly. I have children in school. The lunch period is 10 minutes. It's a little crazy, right?
Mhm.
I'm in very intrigued. I know you have heard people say this, and it's very popular to talk about in health communities online, but people will sometimes talk about tolerating food better in Europe. And I took a lot of I've monitored this. I've really kind of turned this over in my head when visiting there. And I'm like, they're having so much more fun and they're enjoying their
Yes.
meals so much more slowly because they're smoking and staying up really late and drinking a lot of alcohol, but they're having a good time, right? They're enjoying company. They're actually taking a long meal that's very normal for them. Whereas we are typically eating as fast as we can, whether we realize it or not. This was actually a big pain point for me for a long time. I couldn't quite figure out why I was finished eating before everyone else for a very long time. But I grew up with a military dad and he was like, it was like instant, right? And so, kind of what your
Right.
conditioning is, you tend to absorb typically. And so, it took a lot of unlearning and, and relearning to kind of let that go. So, at the very top level, which is extremely important, is that stress is suppressing digestion. So, that means we're going to need to support digestion at different times. And this is where the conversation around kind of ultra processed food is potentially valuable as well, or being exposed to things that you don't always eat. Sometimes you're not
Mhm.
digesting those things particularly well either. Meaning, I'm saying, like, if you go traveling and you get indulgent, and I love to be indulgent when I travel, I love to try new things. But when I'm doing those things, I may need to take some additional digestive support because these are weird things that my body's not necessarily used to digesting. And there's a lot of things I don't control when I'm out in the wild, right? And that's okay. I'm not stressed about that. I'm just going to support my body to digest it because I don't expect that your body should be able to digest frankenfoods or ultra processed foods or things that are not even truly food ingredients, what we put in foods. I don't expect that your body should necessarily be able to do that well. And so I want to help it process through that instead of taking a big stress. So I just kind of putting that in there as well, because that's where a little bit of that conversation can play in. So
Right.
stress, it suppresses the digestion, but it also suppresses the immune system. Now we know the immune system is also in the gut, not surprising. There's a specific marker that we can see on testing where it gets very suppressed called secretory IgA. This is the immune system cells in the gut lining. Now, this is again very commonly suppressed by stress. It's also suppressed by pathogen overgrowth, or essentially those weeds being overgrown in general. And remember, if we're not digesting, we're going to feed those weeds. The weeds love to consume undigested foods. So it's sort of like this
Mm.
self-supporting system. It's like this happens, and so it's, of course, this is the ecosystem we're in. So those are a couple main things. Now, if the immune system is suppressed, you may or may not see more frequent illness. I would say getting a cold more than once or twice a year is frequent. So I think sometimes if we've had colds more often than that, we sort of need to like have a metric to somewhat go by. So we can kind of maybe assume that something like that's going on. Again, this is something that is on some testing. A conventional GI may not consider this an incredible marker. And so I only tell you these things just because sometimes when you hear these things on podcasts, you'll maybe seek out some of that information from different providers. And so I just want you to have options or to know how you might be met with that. So with secretory IgA, when that is suppressed from stress, there are some specific things that can improve it. Immunoglobulins, bovine immunoglobulins, somewhat in the form of colostrum. There's also non-colostrum options, vitamin A retinol, and Saccharomyces boulardii. It's an antifungal probiotic yeast. So all of those things will improve secretory IgA. And I think this is important in this like winter season because we tend to have a more suppressed, well, not everyone has a suppressed immune system, but sometimes you're traveling, sleeping less, like things that we don't always recognize as stress will still stress the
Right.
system. And then when we've all experienced this at some point where we had a stressor and then it allows the illness to kind of take over, it makes you opportunist, these issues, or viruses especially, are very opportunistic. So they're going to take hold when the immune system is suppressed overall. And also with exposure to like mold or mycotoxins, that'll really suppress the immune system as well. So stress, there's many things that can look like stress on the body. So digestion, immune system, and then the other big bucket that stress does, in my opinion, I mean, there's many more things, but it's also really going to deplete nutrients. Now, there's multiple, of course, on the front end, we were talking about digestion. If you're not digesting, you're not really absorbing nutrients, right? Stomach acid suppressed, you're not digesting those animal proteins. They require that, absorb the B12. So there's all of that. And then also with stress hormone or stress chemistry, as like cortisol goes up, potassium is dumped, magnesium is depleted. And this is where you will sometimes see, now a few people will resonate with this, some people will not, but maybe you'll see eye twitching, or like
Wow.
or like a leg cramp, like restless leg or something like that. Those are pretty severe symptoms, to be perfectly honest. Something a little bit lighter could be, just a little tension headache, but still that can be kind of a little more severe. Or even increased cramping with your period, right? Because the magnesium is a muscle relaxant overall. And so dumping out the potassium, by the way, potassium is pretty underappreciated. It's actually the sodium and potassium are the doorway into the cell. And so actually I consider that magnesium and the calcium are on the outside. They're kind of like the bouncers of the doorway into the cell. So a lot of people understand magnesium, but not so much the logical order of how minerals come into the cell. So potassium is pretty under recognized or underappreciated. And it's a really big nutrient for blood sugar, improving blood sugar, which is the backbone of all hormones, whether you realize it or not. And then also with checking thyroid into the cell as well. So you don't need to have, issues on blood labs to have opportunities to improve blood sugar. You don't need to have issues on blood labs to improve thyroid. By the time these things show up on blood labs, they're significant at that point, right? So the sooner we catch those things, the sooner we support a system. You mentioned this earlier, and this is my entire thing, is like, if you support the systems to work and function optimally, you win because most symptoms are coming from, and you've learned this as we've talked, is the system gets compromised because of one or two or many reasons. The system gets compromised, it becomes depleted or imbalanced, and then symptoms present. So when you bring back balance, when you get things back into balance, when you replete the deficiencies, you do not have the symptoms start to fall away by supporting the
Yes.
systems.
Oh, Krista, we're really going to get into that in the second half. And I can't even believe we're out of
I
time
can't
for
believe it
this
either.
half. But you have given such an amazingly detailed overview of, how stress affects digestion and what can happen in our immune system as a result of that. And I am so excited for the second half because this is really about what I am very passionate about, which is restoring balance, whether it's psychologically or
Mm.
nutritionally. So, we're going to get into precisely how you might help somebody with food sensitivities when we come back for the second half. So, thank you so much for joining us for this half. Please tune in next week for the second half of this amazing interview with award-winning dietitian, root cause nutritionist, and host of the popular Less Stressed Life podcast, Christa Biegler.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into the ANEW Insight podcast. Please remember, the contents shared on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. You can find us anywhere podcasts are streaming, on YouTube at my.anew.insight and at anew-insight.com under the ANEW Insight podcast tab. And follow us on our socials at my.anew.insight on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads for more updates. Tune in next time and evolve with us.